You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Greetings, everyone. Coach Jen here, and thanks for tuning in to Horse Tip Daily, episode 1490, brought to you today by Fry's Equine Insurance.
Hi everyone, Glenn here, founder of the Horse Radio Network and host of Horses in the Morning. Susan Strawser is here from Fry's Insurance and has agreed to help us with a 5-part series on insurance, helping us all understand what we are buying and what we need. If you missed last month's, we discussed horse mortality and health insurance for your horse, and you can find it at horseradionetwork.com/insurance. Today in part 2, we are talking about liability insurance. So, Susan, if I'm a private horse owner and I have horses at home and maybe show, but I'm not a professional, what do I need for liability insurance?
Good question, Glenn. What we have are a couple different liabilities insurance depending on what you're doing with your horses. So if you're a private horse owner, someone who owns their horse for pleasure, for show, typically you keep your horse at home or possibly boarded at a facility. We have what's called a private horse owner's liability policy that typically covers between 2 and 5 horses. And we're going to cover if the horse themselves cause a liability incident to somebody else or somebody else's property.
So if my horse gets loose, crashes the fence, goes over and kicks the side in of my neighbor's brand new Tesla, does it cover that?
Yes,
Okay.
that's the intent of the policy.
Okay, great. So if my horse does damage to other people's stuff.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Typically what we would see is a horse gets out on the road, gets hit by the car. We're going to take care of the car and the people in the car. Or
Gotcha.
perhaps the horse is outside, backs into one of your guests' car. We've had one set on the roof of the car and did quite a bit of damage.
Yeah, we
So
had
that
one
would
actually
be
do
this
that too, where they sat on the side of the car and smashed it all in.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So what's different with the homeowner's policy? Does my normal homeowner's policy cover that?
Well, that's something you would have to check with a homeowner's agent because all policies across the different companies are written differently. And a regular homeowners is probably going to cover liability maybe on your own property. But once you leave your property, then it's really how that policy is written.
So does the private horse owner's liability policy, it's a PHO for short, does that cover if I take my horse away to a show, my horse gets loose? Every show we've ever been to, there's been a loose horse. And my horse gets loose and then crashes into the car?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we're going to cover your liability, whether it's on your property, right off of your property, or while you're at a show or maybe trail riding.
What about boarding facilities? We board our horses.
We get that question a lot. What if I board my horse? The barn owner has coverage, and that's probably true. However, the barn owner's policy covers the barn owner and not the boarders in the barn. So your private horse owner's liability would then extend to that boarding facility for your coverage.
So I was wondering, a scenario came up over the weekend. So we're driving around where we board. It's a very nice neighborhood, very wealthy neighborhood. If I'm driving my cart around, my horse bolts, and I take out the neighbor's whatever, and will it cover in that instance then?
Yes,
Okay.
because your liability policy is going to cover you as you travel. So it follows the horse.
Okay.
A liability policy is written we typically see 1 to 10 horses. Once you get up over 10 horses, then you switch over to a different type policy. But we name the horses or the number of horses on the policy. And so we're covering each individual horse up to the limits of your policy.
Gotcha. Okay. I understand now. So what happens if I'm running an equine business? What happens if I have a boarding stable or, I'm running a training business out of my barn? Then what?
Okay, then you need to look at the equine liability policy, which is designed for someone who is running a business. So if you're training horses, you're doing lessons, you're running a boarding program. Now, ideally, you would write that in with a farm policy, which we'll discuss next time. But if you maybe you lease a barn or you're an independent, so you travel from place to place, then you need a liability policy that's geared toward a business operation. Most homeowners policies will exclude coverage if you are running a business. So that's why you need to be able to pick your liability up somewhere else.
Could you give me some examples of where that would come into play?
Sure. If you are, say you're giving lessons in your barn and a student would fall off their horse during the lesson, then your liability policy would come into play because that's bodily injury to a third party. And we would first defend you, and then if you are found negligent, then we'll pay up to the limits of your policy. But it could be that maybe you misjudged the student's riding level, and put them on a horse that they couldn't handle, or it could be that the environment wasn't safe. We had a claim where a lesson was being given in an arena, and outside the arena, somebody pulled a weed whacker cord and started a weed whacker just as the horse was coming around the inside of the arena.
That's usually when it happens.
Yes. And so in that case, that was an unsafe environment that was provided. So liability did come into play then.
When I'm driving around the neighborhoods, that kind of stuff happens almost every time you're going by. They wait until you get right in front of the yard to start the tractor, or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly.
But that leads me to the next question, because in many states like Florida, they have equine liability laws that, and the signs are out of the boarding stable we're at now. The signs are out that this is dangerous and you're doing this at your own risk. Doesn't that cover us in those states? I know Kentucky had that too.
Yes, many states have an equine liability law. And so, yes, they do go a long way in keeping a lot of lawsuits out of courts. However, the person giving the lesson or the trainer or the property owner could be negligent, and that's where you need insurance. And plus, you have to look at not all the rules of these liability laws are followed the way they should be. So, for example, you may not have the proper wording in your liability release form, or your state may require that you post a sign. So if you don't follow the rules of that law of your particular state, then you could have an incident. And again, you could be at fault, such as the example of, the weed whacker being started outside the arena. That's not going to be covered under those equine liability laws.
I thought about that, and I often wondered if, negligence still comes into play. If you're negligent, you're negligent. And that never stops somebody from suing you anyway, So,
oh, exactly.
Right.
I tell my clients, if it were my child and they were hurt during a lesson, I don't know that what I signed would stop me from filing a lawsuit, especially if I thought the instructor was negligent. So, when you look at your liability policy, for what you pay in a year, you're probably only paying for about 1, 2, maybe 3 hours of an attorney's fee. And so it's always good to have that peace of mind that these liability policies will provide you.
So listeners will get mad if I don't ask. You brought it up. What's it cost for the liability insurance?
Very good. Yes, that is the big question we get. So the private horse owners liability policies typically run about $275 a year. Now that's going to vary depending on the number of horses that you own. And so that can go up from there, but that's going to be your base amount. As far as the equine liability policies, those premiums are based on the activity you do. So for someone who's giving, maybe 2 or 3 lessons a year, you may be, looking at around $500-$600 a year. But the more you do, the higher your risk is. And so the higher the premium is. So you can always call our agency, and we'll be happy to get some information from you and be able to give you some estimated quotes.
Very good. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about was horse clubs, events, shows, things like that. Do you do liability insurance for those?
Yes, we do. So let's start with horse clubs. As a club, you do have a liability exposure, especially if you're going to different locations to host shows. You may have meetings. So because the club is an entity, it could be sued if it as a club or its members cause a liability incident. So if you're having a meeting and somebody starts a fire on accident within the meeting place, well, then the club needs to have their liability insurance. Now, under a club policies, members are covered when they're acting on behalf of the club. So if you're at a show and you have a club member who is running extension cords for the sound system and somebody falls over that extension cord, then that member was acting as a club member. So we're going to provide coverage for both the club and that member. We won't provide coverage if they're acting on their own behalf. So they've entered a horse into the show and cause a liability incident. Then they would need their private horse owners.
Gotcha. And the same applies for horse shows?
Exactly. Now, horse shows are covered a little differently because they're covered individually. If you don't have a club policy or you don't need one, then you would have an individual show liability policy or event policy. And so that's going to provide you that same coverage. If you or one of your volunteers causes a liability incident, damages someone's car, or someone gets hurt, then you will be provided your defense under this policy.
Very good. And so how do they get a liability quote? What do they do?
Well, they need to give us a call in the office and we can get some basic information from them. A lot of times we can give an estimated quote over the phone, but that's just an estimate because everything needs to run past underwriters and they will look at your risk and then give us premiums for you. But give us a call and we'll be able to help you with that.
And the phone number is 614-875-3711 or send an email from the website, right? They can just go to the website at FrysEquineInsurance.com.
Exactly.
And it's FRYS, equineinsurance.com. Listen
Yes.
to next time as we discuss farm owners' policies.
Well, there you have it. Horse Radio Network has thousands of engaging podcasts for horse people, and you can have them sent right to your phone. Just subscribe via your favorite podcast player. This is Coach Jen, and I will be back again soon with another tip. Until then, go ride your horse. The Horse Radio Network and the Horse Radio Network hosts are not responsible for statements made by guests on the Horse Tip Daily. Please use your own judgment when listening to the tips on this show.